Okay, very good. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight for this important briefing on COVID vaccines. An update on the latest therapeutic options. Although the COVID vaccine is not widely available to the public yet, information about it is, and it often comes by way of social media or other intermediary outlets. It's not always reliable or science-based. Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing firsthand from the experts at Mount Sinai how the vaccine works, what is known, what is not yet known about it. Mount Sinai has also been on the forefront of tremendous advancements in therapeutics. These very effective interventions need to be administered in a particular way at a particular phase of the illness, and we will review what those particulars are so members of our community are aware of these life-saving options. Mount Sinai Hospital has been especially dedicated to the care and health of our community, and we owe them our gratitude. President Dr. David Rich, who's been a tremendous ally in helping care for our community, is on this call, and we are honored he's able to join us. Our panel discussion tonight will be moderated by our own Dr. Victor Grazi, the Mount Sinai doctor himself and a former president of Sephardic Bikor Cholim. Dr. Grazi has been working across organizations of our community since the beginning of the COVID crisis, not only in his capacity as a medical professional, but also as a committed, dedicated, and respected community leader. I must take this opportunity just for a moment to thank the doctors in our Community Doctors Network. You all know who you are, and the people that are involved with it know how dedicated and caring everyone has been since the beginning of this crisis. I look forward to the time when the crisis is over and being able to tell the story of the Doctors Network. The entire community should be aware of your incredible and selfless work on their behalf. We almost thank Jack Hittery for helping us arrange this evening's talk. Jack has been working tirelessly, not only to help educate the public about prevention and treatment options, but also daily on a case-by-case, family-by-family basis, helping the community members access appropriate and timely care. So now I'll throw it to Jack Hittery. Thank you, Jack.
Jeff, thank you very much. Thank you, SCA, SBH, and others for organizing this evening. Thank you to Mount Sinai for joining us tonight and providing this information at a critical juncture in this pandemic. I'd like to introduce now the president of Mount Sinai, David Rich. David has been in the bunkers with us, hand in hand with our communities, fighting this fight and making sure that the community has access to the latest breakthroughs. Mount Sinai is not only one of the greatest medical institutions, but is making sure that in this particular pandemic is at the forefront of the breakthroughs and literally making science happen day by day. With that, let me introduce Dr. David Rich, president of Mount Sinai. David.
Thank you, Jack. First of all, I want to just say that it's a pleasure to be, really to have gotten to know you over the past several months. For those of you who don't know on the call, Jack has been instrumental in bringing together scientific communities around the nation to talk about COVID therapeutics since the very early days when New York was the epicenter in March and April. And it's been a remarkable conversation, and he deserves tremendous credit for helping advance science by creating that forum where people feel safe to share ideas. So I will now talk a little bit in reverse order. I'll get to vaccines at the very end, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the story of Mount Sinai and COVID, because like any other group, no one really knew what was coming. We had no idea that COVID had been spreading so extensively, probably based upon our data, since we developed an antibody test and were able to look at blood samples from February. And we were starting to find antibodies to the COVID virus in some of our stored blood samples as far back as the early part of February, which means that the very beginning of February, the end of January, there were already cases in New York. And then suddenly at the end of March, we had this massive explosion in hospitalizations, of course, because it had been spreading wildly and no one knew about it. Well, we learned a lot in those early days. First of all, we learned that it could be a very deadly disease. We learned that it could overwhelm hospitals very easily, and that when people didn't get access to care, of course, you know, if they were in an emergency room and they couldn't get to an intensive care unit, it was not good. So the necessity of bending the curve became clear to everyone very early. We discovered, I believe, at Mount Sinai some things that put us a little bit ahead of the curve. I am president of Mount Sinai, so I will say good things about our organization, but I'm very impressed in that the doctors of Mount Sinai were very early in administering convalescent plasma. We're among the first in the nation and probably have the world's largest experience as a health system with convalescent plasma infusion. And we've pivoted and are now doing research where we collect plasma, and we're working with an organization in Canada, Emergent Biosolutions, that turns it into a concentrated antibody product called hyperimmune globulin. And we're just beginning research with that now. And we think that will be a very exciting replacement because convalescent plasma is certainly much better than nothing, but it is not the most effective therapy and has not really shown that much scientific benefit, even though we believe that in certain circumstances it's quite good. And now we're delighted also that we're starting to give at Mount Sinai monoclonal antibodies. So the same concept, but these are being given to people in the pre-hospital phase of care. Remember that COVID is the type of disease where you get infected, and then about 5 days later on average is when you have symptoms. And then it usually isn't until day 8 of symptoms that you end up in the hospital. So by the time you end up in the hospital, it's already like 13 days in. So only in the very early phase of care are antibodies really going to be effective, because once you're making your own, it doesn't make a difference anymore. So what does that mean for the community? It means that as soon as we know someone in a high-risk group, which is older than 65, or over 55, but with significant heart or lung or other types of disease, diabetes, obesity, that we should be talking to your doctor and figuring out if that patient who's just been diagnosed with COVID, really in the first few days, would benefit from receiving antibody therapy. And so that's the thing that I want to say to everyone about antibody therapy. I'm also very proud of how Mount Sinai has decreased the death rates of patients that do require admission to hospital by a very significant degree, but it's still a very deadly disease. We made advances in discovering things at Mount Sinai. I think we were the first to publish on the association of using blood thinning drugs with improved outcome, and we're continuing that research, and we believe it's very promising. Also, I believe that having just worked with the rest of the medical community, that we've learned that the combination of the drug remdesivir and either convalescent plasma, or hopefully in the future, other forms of antibody therapy in the very early phase of care, and then later in care, drugs known as steroids that help with the lungs and managing the lung inflammation that occurs. And of course, in certain people, blood thinners, because they're at higher risk of complications. So where does that leave us now? We still have a very deadly disease. And although some people talk about it, there is no evidence of herd immunity. And even if there are very small clusters of individuals that have herd immunity, we don't have good evidence that people won't be reinfected. And the communities at large need to follow these public health measures for several more weeks until we can have enough availability to start vaccinating large percentages of the public. Now, I'm not a vaccine expert, and I don't want to make my comments completely about vaccines, but I wanted to end by saying that the vaccines that have been released so far and the ones that will come out, none of them come out in the United States without review of the FDA. And we have a very, very good organization there that, although, as someone who runs a hospital, I can tell you they drive me crazy too, but they're here to protect the American public. And they've taken that responsibility very seriously. And the vaccine that I had the honor of, I actually gave the first 5 shots. Being an anesthesiologist, I'm very familiar with administering medications by injection. And so I was delighted to give the first 5 vaccinations to our staff yesterday. And I think that the testimonials of the healthcare providers that are taking this vaccine, and the fact that they'll receive the first, frankly, several million doses, is something that should reassure everyone in the general community that this is something which is safe and it's effective, and it's the only way we're going to get out of this mess. And although the vaccines are not going to be mandatory at present in places like New York State, we could see a future when there's enough availability of vaccines, probably in the middle or a little bit later in 21, where we might see schools actually requiring vaccination or others. So I think it bears close study. I think it bears just attention to the data as they come about. There is no medical treatment that doesn't have someone who has an adverse reaction. And so there will be, one in, tiny fractions of a population, maybe 1 in a million, who will have a severe reaction to any medication we give. But the number of people whose lives will be saved by preventing severe disease, which is what has been proven thus far about the initial vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, it's a chance to save lives. And we believe in pikuach nefesh. We know what it is. And although you will find that there's a lot of false information out there, my hope is that by hearing from the experts from Mount Sinai and your own medical community, because we have just so much enjoyed in the height of this crisis and throughout the whole thing, the bridges that we've built with the Sephardic community has been one of the golden linings of what's happened in the crisis. We've made new friends, and we hope that as your friend, you can begin to develop trust in our judgment, and hopefully it will help with convincing the community that the most important thing we can do is to, at the present, observe the public health measures and refrain from large gatherings and the masking and the social distancing. But within a few months, we have to be enthusiastic and we have to be advocates for health. And the best way to get out of this crisis is to convince as many of our community as possible to protect themselves and protect their loved ones by taking a safe and effective vaccine. So I think at that point, I'll end my introductory comments and I'll stay on for a few minutes, but I believe that it's best that I let the physicians who care for COVID patients on a day-by-day basis. I can speak to Victor Grazzi, who was a colleague of mine back when we were residents at Mount Sinai in the 80s and has risen to a position of prominence in the community. I'm delighted he's here as well, but also Dr. Jeffrey Bander, a cardiologist, and Dr. Josh Ushaskas, a cardiologist, both of them at Mount Sinai, have developed tremendous relationships with the community, but they've been there with every patient. They've walked through the entire process. They can tell you better than anyone how we treat COVID at present, and they can also tell you that this is a terrible disease. And whatever we can do to prevent it, whatever we can do to get people who are at high risk into early treatment, these are all very good things, and listen closely to them. They know what they're saying. They're great doctors, and they're great human beings, and they're also fantastic emissaries to our beloved communities, and that now includes these new friends that we've made in the Sephardic community. So I want to again thank Jack and Jeff for helping organize this conference, and everyone who's attending, because it's extremely important that we take these next steps forward together, that we have an open dialogue and conversation, and we help build trust in science and medicine and save lives. And that's why we're here, to save lives. So thank you all so much for listening to my opening comments.
David, thank you very much for those opening remarks. And again, thank you for the commitment of Mount Sinai to our community. We have been sending many, many patients from our community to Mount Sinai. And again, as you pointed out, Drs. Bander and Dr. Shatskis have been there with us. I've had calls with them at midnight, at 1 a.m., at 9, at every hour of the day. They've been there for us, along with many other Mount Sinai doctors as well, who are not on this call today. So again, thank you for your leadership, and thank you for the commitment of Mount Sinai to our community. Let me now turn to our own Dr. Victor Grazzi, as you pointed out, David, one of our foremost doctors in our community of physicians, and who will moderate tonight's panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jack. On a personal note, I need to thank Dr. Rich and the entire administration of Mount Sinai. It's a vast medical system encompassing several medical centers, ambulatory care centers. I've been there for 36 years. same amount of time as Dr. Rich has. And I must tell you that through this pandemic, they've been steadfast and committed in their commitment to healing, not only the patients, but the staff. Working on the labor floor, we serve as frontline workers, and the amount of care and attention they've provided us to make sure that our wellness is maximized, that our opportunity to have more than appropriate amounts of PPE, wellness programs for those of us who dealt with quite a bit of stress. So I don't want to belabor the point because there's a lot more that we need to cover, but I couldn't allow this program to continue without thanking Mount Sinai. It's been a wonderful place to work. I was a patient there myself about 3 weeks ago. Everything went wonderfully. And I encourage all of you, if you need care, to seek care. We partner with other institutions, but Mount Sinai is in my heart. So let's move on. Okay, on to the program. I'd like to welcome our two expert physicians. Dr. Josh Shatzkis knows our community well. He is an assistant professor of medicine and cardiology at the Mt Sinai Medical Center and the co-director of the plasma collection program. Dr. Jeffrey Bander is an associate professor of medicine and cardiology and is the medical director of the Mt Sinai Hospital Network. So I hope all of our listeners, all of our viewers see, we have the president of the medical center, we have leading clinicians from the medical center. We want to address your concerns, and we want to show the commitment of Mount Sinai to our community. I'd like to open things up. We'll start with some of the therapeutic questions, and then we'll segue into the vaccines. We all know, as Dr. Rich mentioned, that we need to continue our vigilance regarding masking, social distancing, hand washing, et cetera, avoiding large crowds indoors until we get to the point where we have the herd immunity, which will only be achieved in a sensible way by a broad vaccination program. Nonetheless, until we get there, I was curious if you could comment, please. Someone's healthy, feels well, has no reason to suspect they have COVID. Besides the social distancing guidelines, which we've repeated in each of these meetings, what steps, if any, might someone be able to take to prevent them from getting COVID or from having a severe course of illness if they were to contract the disease? We've heard about various vitamins, various supplements, real, not real. Share with us your thoughts, please.
I can start. First of all, just 5 seconds. Thank you very much to the community for hosting us tonight, and thank you for having me on the panel. I think really for prevention, I don't think of anything else as more important than the measures that you've already stated, which is social distancing and wearing masks. The only thing I would add to that is that once you know that you've come in close contact with somebody who has tested positive or has symptoms and is awaiting results of a positive test, that you take proper precautions and quarantine yourself so that you are not a source of spread going forward. In terms of the second part of your question of knowing if you're going to be one of these people that progresses to a more severe case, that's exactly the conundrum with COVID that we face on a daily basis. Is we have a hard time predicting or knowing who is going to be fine and just have a mild course or no course at all, and who is going to have a severe course, which is why our focus often is on the people who are the highest risk, because the people who are the highest risk are also the ones who are at the highest risk of having significant complications develop if their course does take a turn for the worse. And so I think that the measures you laid out are perfect, and just using good judgment when interacting with friends and family is the best steps that one can take.
So any role for vitamin D supplementation, zinc supplementation,
so
many of the things we'll read about.
All of these things, when they looked at patients when they came into the hospital, they were vitamin C deficient, vitamin D deficient. And there have been some studies that showing that when, vitamin D supplementation, vitamin C will help, combat it. Nothing hard, but I definitely think there's really, in low doses, vitamin C, vitamin D, and zinc are harmless. So I encourage people to take supplements like that. I think that's a generally thing that we'd recommend, but certainly for vitamin C and vitamin D, not an issue. We don't give, people often ask to give high dose vitamin C. It can cause kidney stones. So taking the, over-the-counter supplement of vitamin C and vitamin D, I think is a fair recommendation that we tell people. I think it's.
So if someone reaches the point where they suspect that they do have COVID, it's hypothetical situation, they've been tested and they're either asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic. Dr. Rich alluded to the fact that use of the monoclonal antibodies plays a role early in onset of illness. I think it's important, and one of the main reasons we asked to put together this program was for people to understand that early intervention can make a significant difference. So I'd like you to please share with us, someone has mild symptoms, what steps should they take? What treatments may be appropriate at that phase of illness to prevent it from progressing to a severe one that requires hospitalization or worse?
So Mount Sinai currently has monoclonal. Jeff, do you want to take this one or should I go?
No, you can talk about the monoclonal. I just wanted to make one brief comment about, this understanding COVID as an illness, right? So I think, we as clinicians, we keep saying it over and over again, but to the public understand that there's really these different phases of the illness. And I think it's important as a context before we understand treatment to understand what happens. So, when you get a virus or an infection, your body fights off, the foreign invader, either it's a bacteria or a virus, and you're done with it. But in COVID, the problem tends to be the second part of the disease, which is after the infection, there comes an inflammatory phase where the body's own immune system is dysregulated. And that's really sort of been the biggest problem with COVID that we're treating. So what we're trying to do in the early phase of disease, and we'll talk about, Josh can talk about who qualifies for monoclonals, is our theory is if we can eliminate the early part of the disease and make it a shorter course, we might trigger less of that inflammatory phase, that second phase where people really get ill. So, Josh, why don't you talk about the monoclonals, then we can talk about the other things that people can do.
Sure. Yeah. So as Jeff was referring to, that first phase is when a virus is just doing what any other virus does to you. And so monoclonal antibodies, which are currently available at Mount Sinai under an emergency use authorization, and let's talk about that just for a second. That means that it hasn't been approved by the FDA because there's not long enough studies, but there's enough initial evidence to suggest that this is something that can really help people. And so the FDA has given what's called an EUA, or emergency use authorization. And so Mount Sinai now for a few weeks has had both from Eli Lilly and from Regeneron monoclonal antibody products, which are basically synthesized products meant to fight the virus. And what we have at Mount Sinai now is if somebody tests positive and starts having mild symptoms, within 5 days of having their mild symptoms, if they are a high-risk patient, and briefly that's people over the age of 65 and people with certain comorbidities like diabetes or kidney disease or severe obesity, or if they're age 55 and over with heart disease or lung disease or hypertension, people like that can receive monoclonal antibodies at Mount Sinai, which with the intention of fighting the virus during that first stage, so they hopefully don't progress to that second stage that Jeff was referring to before. And so that's why early intervention, if you're one of those high-risk patients, is so important. Jeff, do you have anything to add?
I think that really covers it. And so again, it's a limited supply, which is why we have criteria. Again, the vast majority of younger people or non-comorbid people will be fine without receiving monoclonal. So we want to reserve it for those who are at the greatest risk right now. Hopefully, as things scale up, we'll be able to have more of the product. But right now, that's why it's limited.
So I think I should reemphasize that's a very important point of departure from what the clinical advice we were giving to people previously, where we were telling people if you were mildly symptomatic, best to stay at home, monitor your oxygen levels, your respiratory rate, stay in touch with your physician. But I think what we're hearing now, and a very critical point for us to reemphasize, is with those risk factors, early intervention with monoclonal antibodies can and would be expected to make a significant difference. So for those in those risk groups, please heed that advice. And
Victor, let me take that a step forward even further with even for someone who doesn't get monoclonal antibodies, the importance of early intervention. Let's again go back to what Jeff was just talking about, is there seems to be some transition point that takes place between when the virus is just causing a mild viral syndrome to where it transitions to something more significant, where people are thinking, do I need to go to the hospital? Do I need something more? Beyond monoclonal antibodies, making that decision is the toughest part. And that's where having open communication with your physician, with your provider, is so important in trying to understand what your course is. And if you are someone that feels like you're starting to deteriorate and you can get to the hospital, there are options available in the hospital now, like plasma and remdesivir, which Dr. Rich mentioned earlier. Remdesivir is an antiviral medication. Plasma is another form of antibodies. those are things that you need to be given early on in the process. And so if you wait too long to go to a hospital, even if you didn't get monoclonal antibodies, but you're thinking, I'll go to the hospital and I'll get other stuff later, that's not necessarily on the table either if you wait too long. So trying to find the right time that you have to go to the hospital is the toughest part, and where you really need to be in touch with your provider and making that decision.
The monoclonal.
Yeah, I think that.
Go ahead, Jeff. Sorry.
Now, I was just going to say, this is the Goldilocks problem. If the parable that we have is who needs to be in the hospital. And I think that's a game we play all the time, because majority of people will be okay, and it's really cherry picking. And I think at this point, we would like to be, because we have treatments, and what differs from now, from Pesach time to now, is that we do have these options. And I think that's important that we, again, the pulse ox and all those things need to be monitored at all times, discuss with your physician when you come in. And it's a tough call, but that's why we're here to answer those questions.
So could I just clarify that point? The monoclonal antibodies are generally used prior to hospitalization.
Yes. So
Correct.
In fact, they're only used in the hospital. The studies actually showed if you're already in a hospital and have an oxygen requirement, when they actually looked at the monoclonals, they didn't have a benefit. So, they really work to clear the virus before they cause the damage to the lung. So they're really most effective super early. So that's why we actually not approve the EUAs for outpatient. They're not for inpatients who require oxygen already.
Is there obviously there's a limited supply. What's the likelihood of someone having access to the monoclonal antibodies should it be necessary? Has that yet become a challenge? I anticipate at some point it will be.
It probably will be at some point. At the moment, there is availability, but as Jeff mentioned before, because there is a limited supply, that's why these restrictions are in place in terms of who's getting it right now, and why we have sort of those limitations. So somebody who's 43 and saying, I want them, in an ideal world, we would be giving it to everyone who tests positive. At some point, we're going to run out.
More is being produced, but then right now the messaging is not there. Most people don't know it's available. Our communities do know about it, and I think that again, messaging through us, we're able to advocate, but it is scarce.
Yeah, I think that's an important message for us to share, not only with the individual members of our community, but also the primary care providers. That early intervention in that high risk group, as opposed to last spring, there is really a marked difference in our ability to intervene. Assuming someone unfortunately does require hospitalization, Doc, each of you have touched upon the remdesivir treatment and the plasma therapies. One of the things that I've been hearing is that clinicians have, I don't believe with the appropriate amount of data, been using steroids in the outpatient phase, and that's something that I think we need to address directly and head on, please. I think
it's very clear now, of all the treatments that we have, that if we talk about plasma, steroids, remdesivir, blood thinners, I think steroids probably are the most important one of those treatments. And I think they're all important, but I think steroids are important. I think we've learned early on from some trials that occurred after the first wave that the steroids, whose basic job is to really just turn off the immune system, can really decrease morbidity and mortality of the disease. So anybody who's hypoxic is a candidate for steroids. And I think the important thing in the outpatient world, which you hit on, is steroids are not without side effects, right? They, if you think about what the steroids do, is they turn off your immune system. So they make you more susceptible to infections. They also can increase your sugar. So it's something that we want patients to go on if they're hypoxic. It's also a marker that they might need to be in the hospital at the beginning. And so if you need to be on steroids, you should be in contact with a doctor. It's not something that, you should pass around, but definitely, once your oxygen is less than 94%, it's been shown to have a 25 to 30% decrease in your morbidity. So very important drug and a really important discovery.
So are you suggesting that it should only be used within the hospital setting, or is outpatient usage appropriate?
Victor, I'll share my personal practice on that. And I agree with you that there's not enough data about using it on patients in the outpatient setting. The one data point that we do have specifically on the medicine Decadron, which many people in the community may have been given at some point or another, is specifically for the patients that Dr. Bander just spoke about. And so I am personally not giving it to just everybody who tests positive. I agree with you. There's not enough evidence because of the possible side effects that, again, Dr. Bander just talked about. I'm mainly reserving it in the outpatient setting for somebody who is perhaps on the verge of heading to the hospital, maybe resisting going to the hospital, choosing not to go to the hospital. They're telling me that their oxygen is starting to dip down when they're checking at home, or they're describing they're sort of short of breath. That's usually a person I'm telling to go to the hospital. And if they're not going, then that's sort of the only outpatient that I am personally putting on steroids at this time. I am aware that other providers are using steroids much more liberally. Until there's evidence to support that, I have not been making that my practice for just every patient that tests positive.
I think we reassess that every
Does that
day,
answer your
depending
question?
on.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
I think we reassess that point depending also on the saturation of the hospital, right? So if the hospitals are, can handle it, mild cases, we recommend you go. If it's busy, we would say, go on the steroids at home. But again, everything gets changed, which is why I think the key point I want to drive home is, be in contact with the local doctors. We're in contact with a lot of you guys out there, giving guidance on certain patients. So we can't generalize it, but yes, some patients are appropriate for home, most are not.
You raise an important point, though. We know so much more now than we did back in the spring, and I think the public sometimes gets disillusioned when we tell them to do things differently than we may have suggested months ago. But that's the sign of quality medicine. We gain new data, we gain new evidence, we gain new experience, and we're very willing, in fact, enthusiastic about changing our advice. That doesn't mean that there's an element of hypocrisy or an element of inconsistency. It means that we're learning. This is there's a reason they call this the novel coronavirus. We've not seen this before. And it does appear to be quite dissimilar to other coronaviruses that we have experience with. So the discussion we're having today is very distinct from one we would have had even 3 or 4 months ago. That's very helpful. If I could, I read in the paper today, I'm sure people have read it or seen it on the news, a new at-home test for coronavirus. If you could speak to its accuracy and what role it may play in allowing people to re-engage in some level with the outside world.
Josh, you want to take this because I'm no expert in you're talking about the saliva test and the home test, right?
There's a new home test actually that came out today, was given emergency use authorization with a nasal swab that, according to what I read in the lay press, has a 95% sensitivity rate. Do either of you have any?
I wouldn't feel
you may not.
I don't have any specific knowledge of that particular test. And so I would reserve comment on that because I can't speak knowledgeably on it. I would say this, no matter what the test shows, if you've had a close contact with a person, we could use this as a branching off point. If you have close contact with a person, you can test negative. There's a reason that the quarantine rules are in effect when you have a close contact for 2 weeks, is that you can still test positive many days after you have a close contact. So I am unfamiliar with that particular test, but I imagine there's going to have to be a lot of work done to try to figure out what its use is and what point it should be used in sort of setting standards for schools and for workplaces, et cetera, since somebody could test positive much later on after they come in contact with someone.
Yeah, and as a general rule, the antigen tests are viewed based on for symptomatic patients. That's how their efficacy is used. So we use antigen tests like the rapid test, meaning they look to see if pieces of virus are in your nose. If you have symptoms, it's a valid test. If you're not, it's really a difficult test to use. So the PCR is just much more sensitive. But yeah, all these tests will help us move towards anything safer to eliminate people who test positive on these tests. So I think they're useful in that way. But obviously, we'll get to the questions actually interesting about the social distancing after vaccines will be an interesting topic.
Yeah, before we segue to vaccines, I thought it might be nice to do a brief interlude. Can you each of you share with us, please, what your experiences have been, exactly what you've been doing in the hospital vis-a-vis COVID, how it's impacted you personally, how you view medicine, how you view your patients, how you view things in general. I mean, it's had to have been beyond impactful for each of you. So share with us a little bit of what you've been doing, please, and how that has brought you to where you are today.
Jeff, you want to go first, or should I go first?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, how much time do you guys have? I think it's been a very humbling experience for us as physicians. We were trained in a world that, we seem to have a pretty good grasp and control of the world we lived in. And I think one thing that we've seen is that we don't know everything, and that the world is not a stable place as we thought. And so on the negative side, we see how much we don't know. And I would say that's how we felt back in April, a shock that we as a science community were making all these modern medicines, and we suddenly have a virus there's a pandemic. We really didn't think in the back of our minds this would happen, to us at this time in the world. But it did. And so it's really affected us in that way. A really great appreciation for nature and for science. I think the last few months, I think we would say we're very proud of the fact that science really has come to the rescue. I mean, we've made remarkable improvements. No one would have thought when we started this that we'd have a vaccine out in a year. So as a physician and as a scientist, I think I'm very proud. Personally, I'm exhausted. And Josh will tell you, we've been, we were at this in April. We had a little break, for a few months. But since Rosh Hashanah, I mean, we've been pulling 16-hour days, whether rounding in the hospital or on the phone. I mean, Josh and I are a tag team at Mount Sinai. We're seeing peak 40, 50 patients from, the Jewish community in the hospital at a time. It's now down, thank God, to the 20s, but still very sick patients. So we spend our mornings, rounding in ICU, seeing patients, and then arranging for outpatient treatment. So, I'd say that's been difficult on us. It's been difficult on our families, but it's been a great privilege to really help people. And I think that's the call that we all went to medicine for. So we're very happy about that. And, the satisfaction of treating people, if we can just help more people through this, we'll be happy. But we'd love to see it end. That's what I would say. We can't wait to see the end.
What I'm saying to my patients, even though I'm not involved day to day with the work you're doing, is we just have to stay the course, because the cavalry is on its way vis-a-vis the vaccine. So I'm hopeful. I hope you guys are, because you're putting in the frontline work.
Yeah, I would just add to what Jeff said. For anybody who's on this call listening, who's either in medicine or aspires to be in medicine, we all probably at one time or another have written that we're going into medicine to help people. COVID was sort of this opportunity where, I realized both Jeff and I are cardiologists. We both had to sort of shut our practices down, just like the whole rest of the world shut down. And we both sort of volunteered right from the start to jump in and help people. And the two of us, our paths have crossed before, and both of us just took a similar path. They were helping people. And so we just started working together on it. And because people crave connections, and specifically the Jewish communities crave connections, and the hospitals were closed, and that those things weren't existent, there was just, Jeff and I just saw a void and a real opportunity to help people. And it's just one thing led to another. And all of a sudden, everybody seemed to be reaching out to us just to help their family member or to help their patient. If it was another doctor or a rabbi or a family member or a colleague that was reaching out and just saying, just try to do this. And that's sort of how we got here. And then that spiraled more where, we saw Mount Sinai was working on plasma collection, and we both saw an opportunity to help with that. And we said, that's a potentially life-saving treatment. Let's get involved there. And that, as many people on this call know, that's how we've organized drives in the community over the last couple of months, both in Brooklyn and in Deal. We have thanked the Sephardic community for participating in that. And you know what, it's sort of a fulfillment of that thing that you write when you're applying to med school, which is, I want to help people. COVID, while it absolutely sucks, has been our opportunity to actually fulfill that. And somehow, two cardiologists, we've reached this place now. And so I agree with Jeff, though. I will be happy when this is over.
I think what you just alluded to explains very, very, very clearly the fact that in spite of the pandemic and the fear that all of us went through at its outset, I'm less fearful now than I was then for a litany of reasons. But the number of applications to medical school is actually up close to 20% this year, which is astounding considering the stress, physically, emotionally, and all the toll that it's taken on healthcare workers. That more and more people, from a sense of altruism and idealism, are applying to medical school. So that's something I think we all should be proud of. One last thing before we move on, you mentioned families. I imagine one of the most difficult things that each of you have to deal with, not only dealing with your sick patient, critically ill patient, with a lot of unknowns, but also having to work with families that are under tremendous stress, often with limited access to their loved ones. What recommendations can you make to us as community members, as family members, that would help us help you to be more effective, more efficient? I imagine, I know this community. I know on the labor floor, pre-pandemic days, we would have the woman's mother, her mother-in-law, her aunt, her grandmother, two cousins, and her kindergarten teacher attending the birth, and the nurses kind of looked a little askance at that. Obviously now that's not happening, but what can you recommend we do as family and community members to help us make your jobs easier so that you can take better care of our loved ones?
This is an excellent question, and I'm so glad you're bringing it up. I think
Jack gives attribution for the question. He planted it.
I think the first and foremost is identifying a single representative. Obviously, for seeing your family member, whether it's via electronic or otherwise, or visits for as long as the hospital stays open, even through the second wave, that's a separate story. But identifying one family member or one close person that's going to represent the family to communicate with physicians and with other providers, the nurses, that's really important. As this ramps up again, the staff is overwhelmed. Forget talking about me and Jeff. We're talking about the people that are in the hospital, the nurses, everybody. If there's constant phone calls from family, if there's miscommunications or disagreements, or a game of telephone is played where all of a sudden something that's good news turns into bad news, these types of things are happening on a day-to-day basis. We can pick one representative to speak to providers, and try to limit repeat phone calls. That is extremely, extremely helpful to us on a day-to-day basis. Jeff, if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think you said it all. I think it's just challenging times. I mean, when you have a loved one in a hospital on a ventilator, we totally understand, and you can't see them, you can't be there. It's really heartbreaking, and it's something that we've worked really hard. And I think one of the things that we provide is try to have this, not just us. There's some volunteers on the hospital end, Seema Backrack, Michelle Sorcer, who go into the rooms for these patients who can't have visitors, and we just try to provide. And we go in there, provide that human touch. You're going to be okay. You're going to get through this. And I think that's one thing that's lacking. I'll be all health systems, and patients really need that touch, and that it really helps in the healing process. So continuing to engage family, talk to the patients by phone is important, and keep their spirits up. And that's what we're doing, and families should continue doing it. And that's all I have to add.
Dr. Grazi, is it okay if I add a few comments as an advocate? Thanks. I just want to add to the doctor's comments from the advocate point of view. First, I want to also recognize the tremendous work of Nathan Hoffman in our community as a key patient advocate and family advocate, working closely with the doctors on this call and other doctors at Mount Sinai. I want to also recognize Nancy Sutton and her tremendous work over many, many years in building the relationship and advocating for so many of our community patients. To build on the doctor's comments, there's a few things I would recommend to families. One is digitize all your records and get them into one drive. Whether you want to use this drive or that drive, usually every family has a techie person. Find that techie person in the family, get a hold of them, get all your stuff organized in one place so that as you speak to doctors, you have all the blood tests, the CAT scans, the readouts in one place, and you are organized in that way. Second, to underscore what the doctor said, choose one person, one advocate who will be the connection to the doctors, and have, if necessary, a daily call or every other day, whatever the cadence is appropriate for the acuity of that particular patient. Three, make sure you have a sense of the key drivers and the key numbers that you can understand how your loved one is doing. The doctors will help you to identify the 4 or 5 key numbers that will help you. Whether that person is hospitalized or whether they're being treated at home under care of a physician because they're an at-risk person, and you have to make that key decision whether to bring them to the hospital or not. Again, being organized and having a particular point of contact is great. If you want to have somebody who's not an immediate family member, that is an actual nuclear family member, that's okay, but a HIPAA compliance form then has to be signed. And so these forms can be supplied by the hospital, by ourselves and others so that you can then have an appropriate person who you want to be representing the family in that particular interaction. With that, let me turn back to you, Dr. Grazian. Also, we're getting a lot of messages around questions for the doctors on pulse oximetry. What is a pulse oximeter? How do you get one? What are the readings? And when should people be concerned? Back to you.
Before you continue, I want to add one more name. I of course, echo your sentiments on Nathan Hoffman, who's been a tremendous liaison, but also Alan Esses has also been a great assistant to the community in multiple ways. As a Hatzalah member, he's helped organize the drives and has also been a terrific liaison. So I thank those two individuals specifically for all of their help over the last few months in communicating with families.
In response to the questions about the pulse oximetry, can one of you please explain what it is, what numbers we're looking for, which ones are concerning, et cetera?
Yeah, so pulse oxes, you can buy them in most pharmacies. They're little devices that go on your finger and they measure how much oxygen is in your blood. And, they're not as accurate as the hospital ones, but they're pretty good. So a normal person will have an oxygen saturation greater than 95%. And so we start worrying when it below 94% continuously. And I think what's important is you can buy this. It costs anywhere between $20 to $80, and you measure a baseline. If it's really starting to measure below 94, I would call your doctor and get it checked. But it's a really great way for us to keep tabs on people, as Josh said. And so I think that anyone who has COVID and some more than just to have one in the house is also reassuring that your oxygen's not dropping.
How often should one wear it? Check it continuously, intermittently, based on symptoms? You can buy the machine, but how often should I be using it?
I think it depends on how you feel. If you're feeling fine, you don't need to put the pulse oximeter on. If you're starting to cough up a storm and you're starting to ask yourself, am I or am I not feeling short of breath? If that's a question that you're asking yourself, or if you as a family member is looking at someone and you're seeing that, they're taking an extra breath in between talking to me, or they seem to not really want to eat too much because they're catching their breath in between eating, then you should be checking. That's a good time to be checking it. And then if you're seeing that there are times that you're skirting on that level and you're asking yourself that question, then I think that's where you can get with more regular checking. But I think this brings up actually a good point, that to me, the pulse oximeter is less important than how the patient is feeling. If you as a patient or you as a family member looking at a potential patient with COVID, the thing that I find most concerning is, are you or you're not having trouble breathing? And that's the question that if you get COVID, you should ask yourself, or you as a family member should be asking your relative. If you're starting to feel that you're having trouble breathing, that is the time that you should be engaging with your provider. That is the time when you should be, checking a pulse oximeter perhaps more regularly. That is the time you should be wondering, what do I need to do here? Am I somebody that might be needing more elevated level of care than just sitting in my house? And it doesn't mean you necessarily do, but that's where a conversation with your provider is so important.
Thank you. We'll move on to the topic of vaccines, which I know is probably of great interest to the audience. Many of the questions I'm going to ask are based on what I've read, what Jeff Beta's read on social media, concerns people have, often based on misinformation, sometimes not legitimate concerns at times, for sure. It's a new vaccine, people have concerns. So without getting too wonky, I'd like people to understand, please, the difference between the new Pfizer and Moderna messenger RNA-based vaccines versus what we, I guess, would call traditional vaccines that we've known for some time, the measles, mumps, rubellas, the influenza vaccines, the shingles vaccines, et cetera. How are the mRNA vaccines different? And when I hear about messenger RNA and genetic material, why should I not be concerned that this is a new methodology that may have impact on my genetic makeup?
So I'll give the basics, and then Dr. Bander can, he actually can go through a couple of the studies, I think. The basics are that this is not live virus. The biggest takeaway for everyone on this call is that this is not a live virus. This is a different type of vaccine, which, to put into layman's terms, it's teaching your body how to fight something that is on the COVID virus. And that is the reason that this cannot give you the virus, and you will not be at risk of getting the virus from this vaccine. And so it is 2 doses. in between the time that you get the first dose and you get the second dose, your body is doing that learning process. It's seeing that RNA that came from the vaccine. It is teaching itself how to fight what's on the COVID virus. And you are still susceptible to the COVID virus in between that first shot and the second shot, which I believe for both vaccines is 3 weeks apart. And that is the basics of what the vaccine is doing.
No, go ahead, Dr. Bandon.
Good. I mean, there's a lot to talk about. So, I mean, it depends how technical you want to get. I just think it's important to go back and, you know, your normal flu vaccine, your measles, mumps, and rubella, as Josh said, are either attenuated viruses or some form of the virus. And I think, you know, when you have to understand historically, like what transformation, this is like on the level of like, you know, kicking in the industrial complex in a war, that they took these technologies to, you know, normally it takes years and years to develop a vaccine, to go through a process and purify it and make the right one and test its efficacy. And we're talking about creating a vaccine. I mean, it's just, you know, in such a short period of time, and mass produce it. I mean, for these vaccines were mass produced before they even proved to be efficient. They betted on it, different stocks. So producing it. So old vaccine technology, you know, this technology has been around for several years before the pandemic. It was just still, you know, hasn't been in mass production. But no other vaccines, whether it be the, you know, Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna vaccine or any of the, you know, AstraZeneca vaccines, they're all new technology. So whether it's using mRNA or it's using adenovirus vector, they're all novel. No one has ever received this kind of vaccine. We have used these kind of technologies in making like adenovirus and in treating cancers and things like that. So we have used them before. But it is true. I would acknowledge people's hesitancy in knowing this is the first time it's being used. But I can tell you it's been tested quite well. And so what's happening is people understand is that the virus, COVID virus, is a very dangerous virus. So when we started to think of how we can develop vaccines, we couldn't really use the old technology. It was too dangerous, too much work. It would be too slow. So the new tools, the mRNA viruses, adenovirus vectors, were a much safer and a faster route to mass producing these vaccines. So that's why we changed course to a newer technology. Now, these things have been tested now. I mean, cumulatively, you know, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people have received these vaccines. They've been followed. You're right. We're not going to have long-term safety data on these vaccines, but we do know what, you know, the patients who've gotten it, you know, for the first several months, you know, we know the adverse events. We know the risks are very, very low. We can go through what some of the side effects are from the immediate dosing. But, you know, I've looked through all the data on it, looked through adverse events. There really aren't anything that, you know, strikingly that you would say this vaccine is dangerous. It causes, you know, heart attacks or, you know, causes change to your DNA. This virus is, even though we use the word RNA, have nothing to do with DNA. None of these things will enter your genetic code. It doesn't enter the nucleus of your cell, which is where your body stores your genetic material. So it does not affect your DNA and doesn't last around for long. It's actually degraded once it's in you.
So again, I think the take-home message there is, while it's a novel technology, it's one that's been studied extensively in the past. That I think the Pfizer had 40,000 enrollees. The Moderna had about 30 to 35,000 enrollees. So we're talking in those two studies alone, close to 100,000 people that have been studied. And to reiterate your point, because I think it's a concern that people have, we're not impacting people's genetic makeup. We're not introducing, it's not a gene editing technology that people read about that has potentially frightening implications for individuals as well as for society. We're not impacting people's genetic makeup. We're merely introducing the spike protein antigen of the virus, that one limited aspect, not the entire virus, into a system that will allow our bodies to recognize the spike protein and prevent severe infection. I think it's also important for us to share with the audience that safety testing is ongoing. So today we're very enthusiastic, but that doesn't mean we stop our analysis, that we stop our investigation. That will be ongoing. There are post-marketing surveillance studies that will continue for quite some time.
Can I make a comment on that, Victor?
Please do.
I think for everything we've discussed tonight, it's all about risk and benefit for every treatment we've discussed, and now we're at the vaccine. Dr. Bander talked before about steroids, how we think they fight. but they also carry with them a risk of side effects. When it comes to the vaccine, we know what the risks of COVID are. We've seen it in our relatives. We've seen it in our friends. It's not good. We know that this vaccine, even though it's just an emergency use authorization right now, we know that it doesn't contain live virus, and the risks of the vaccine appear to be very mild thus far. A person may get some local irritation. They might spike a fever, but there have been no major side effects that I saw on my brief reading of the vaccine thus far that in any way compare to what COVID could possibly do to you if you're one of those unlucky people that gets the severe cytokine storm, the inflammatory reaction. So everything is about risk and benefit. And to my mind, and that's why I'll get personal here for a moment, I'm a very cynical and skeptical person. Before I started reading the literature, I was someone that was saying, I don't know if I'm going to do this. I don't know if I'm going to take this. I've now read the data. I've now gone over the studies. I've reviewed literature on both of the vaccines. To me, this is not even a question. This is something that is going to help our families. This is going to help our friends. This is going to help the world overall in defeating COVID. And if you get the opportunity, when you get the opportunity to get the vaccine, I think it's something that everyone should do.
You mentioned the risk-benefit ratio. It extends so far beyond that. I mean, I think about the businesses that have been shuttered, my grandchildren who missed 6 months of school, all the experiences we missed out on spending a Seder, 2 Seders, along with my wife, as much as I love her, was not what I want to replicate this year. I want to get back to living. And this is one way we can get there in a safer, faster, quicker way. Side effects, you mentioned some of the immediate ones. There have been some a few isolated reports of 2 out of the UK, one that came out today in the press here in the States about allergic reactions. Again, numerically, it's a small number. We weren't ever going to be expecting any vaccine or any therapeutic or any medical intervention for that matter to have a 0 risk. So please, for our audience, I think it's a very important point as these case reports get amplified to put it in some perspective.
Yeah, if you look at it in perspective, I mean, talking about over, combining the two mRNA vaccines, like over 60,000 patients, and you had a total of 6 deaths, 4 in the placebo arms, 2 in the vaccine arms. And you're talking tiny numbers, and the SAEs were small, less than what we've seen in a normal population.
Time out. You need to go back on that point. 6 deaths, but 4 were in the group that did not get the vaccine. I don't want the take-home message to be 6 out of the 60,000 died. People
I'm saying so
so basically other causes while we're running vaccine trials.
Correct.
Right.
And there were more deaths in the segment that did not receive the vaccine than the segment that did.
Yeah, remember, we're trying to take a subsegment of representative of normal people. People, these are people between, normal complications of life. They died of heart attacks. Nothing to do with the actual vaccine itself. I think the vaccine has been proven to be very, very safe. And I'm looking at the numbers now. It's called the, non-fatal, severe adverse events were also extremely tiny, less than, 0.05, 0.02%. So, we're talking about really nothing that was comparing the group that got remember, they took the vaccines, they were 1-to-1 randomization. So half the people got the vaccine, half the people got, salt water injected. And those people, there are really no differences between those groups in terms of severe events. Now, what is important to know, which is the media is all hyped on because people need something to talk about, is, the way these vaccines are given, they're given with something called lipid nanoparticles. And it sounds fancy, but it's just some things that interrupt your cell wall. And they are what are responsible for causing the side effects of having arm pain and headaches. The vast majority of people who get these vaccines get a headache and they get fatigued for a day or so. That's just a way of knowing that your immune system has kicked in and is working. So, all the noise that people are hearing is about the immediate side effects. And, I spoke to 2 people who got the vaccine 2 days ago, and, they had headaches and they had felt fatigued, but that was it. They were actually at work. They didn't go home. They didn't use the day off that they were actually given. So that speaks well to it. But, the adverse events are not there. The deaths are not there. It's a safe vaccine. But you expect to have some soreness and some headache the day after the vaccine.
Are there any specific populations that should, once it's readily available, we know now it's being limited to first-line healthcare workers, et cetera, who shouldn't receive the vaccine? And why not?
No, you can answer the question about pregnant women. I'll ask you that back.
I'm not so sure I can, but we'll try.
But, again, we talk about what's the, again, as Josh said, you're weighing COVID versus side effects of something, right? So whoever's at risk should get it. The only people that we're saying right now are people that have an allergy. Severe allergy should consult their doctor and, have an EpiPen with them if they have it. But unless you have like a severe allergy, you know.
I was also going to add that I believe the actual EUA is just for people over the age of 16. I don't think that is for any reason that they've seen anything in children. It's just that there's not data in people under that age range. So I don't think anyone should put out there, oh, this isn't something safe for kids. It's the EUA is on very short-term data on a certain population.
I think the studies are ongoing on children. They won't be out for several months now. So let's populate our at-risk group. Obviously, the debate about whether children are vectors of the disease are irrelevant. Let's vaccinate those who are most at risk from developing severe COVID.
Yeah, but I want to double back on that point because I think it's critical. When we say that certain groups at this point, we can't recommend vaccination, that in no way means that it's unsafe in that population and that segment of the population. It merely means that we don't have the data yet to support its use. And I think, for me, what that actually does is reinforces my faith in the integrity of the system. Because if they haven't studied that population, they're not going to grant authorization for use in that population.
Great point.
And to touch on the pregnancy issue, the FDA guidelines, which have been endorsed by the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, is that if a pregnant woman or a lactating woman is in a group at this point that is at risk for contracting the disease, whether they're a healthcare worker or have comorbidities, that we should offer them the vaccine. There are no, I don't believe they included pregnant women specifically in the study. Very difficult to enroll pregnant women in a study for ethical reasons. But again, based on the biology and based on our understanding of the vaccination program, I would be comfortable having this discussion with my pregnant patients, listening to them voice their concerns. But again, the fact that it's not been approved for use in pregnancy doesn't mean it's not safe, which leads me, have you guys seen on social media the reports claiming that vaccination with the COVID vaccine is associated with sterility issues, impairment of fertility, etc.? It's out there, people talking about it. I don't know if you've seen it. If you haven't,
I mean, it's there's a lot of stuff out there, and there are signs. We deal a lot with the Hasidic community, and we've been getting inundated with fake news, with fake signs from Ashkenazi Rabbanim saying that they say that the vaccine is dangerous when it's completely forged. We've actually had to push out clarification letters saying that these things. I mean, there's a lot of fake news out there on these things. Certainly, there would be no data on whether or not it would cause anything because it hasn't been studied, but there's no reason to even suspect it. I think where these things come from is when we do studies, we often have people sign things that, for legal reasons, that they won't get pregnant during the study period because we just don't know. I think it's lawyer talk. But there's just absolutely zero evidence, zero cases of anyone reporting any of these things. So I think it's kind of just something that's trickled down from just standard language and boilerplate in research studies.
Yeah, the problem is it gets amplified. With respect specifically to the fertility issue, one post that I've seen said that the vaccine shares amino acid sequencing and coding with a protein that's critical for the development of the placenta, and actually reached out to the manufacturers, and there's actually no such homology between the protein sequencing. So that's just not true. We're going to get more data as it comes out. I think every pregnant woman ought to look at what her risk is. I certainly understand the hesitation. But again, the fact that it's not officially authorized for use in children or in pregnant women does not mean it's unsafe. It means we're still continuing to collect the data.
I think this is
also that we've
takeaway
taken
point.
care of at least 10 pregnant women in the second wave who've come in first to third trimester, and it's been rough on some people. And so it's pregnancy is not you're treating COVID for two essentially.
Well, we know that pregnant women, compared to when they're not pregnant, the same woman has what we call a state of relative immunocompromise, that her immune system is compromised to begin with. And we also know that pregnant women have changes in how their lungs function, quite dramatically. In fact, it's why a lot of pregnant women feel short of breath consistently. we've actually had some patients, fortunately not many, but we've had patients where they had severe COVID and we couldn't adequately ventilate them. We couldn't adequately get them enough oxygen because the presence of the big enlarged pregnant uterus didn't allow us to ventilate them properly in the face of damaged lungs. So we actually had some cases where we had to deliver babies prematurely, urgently by cesarean section in order to allow the mother to get adequate oxygen. So yes, the concerns in pregnancy are understandable, but we need to understand that pregnant women are at risk as well. And I think it's the kind of thing that needs to be discussed on a case-by-case basis. I don't think we should issue a blanket condemnation or a blanket approbation of its use of pregnancy, but certainly worthy of an in-depth discussion. One of the other questions that came up, again, these not just in pregnancy, but specific, but it generally is, do these vaccines contain thimerosal? Do they contain mercury?
They don't. Yeah.
So the reason people are concerned, as many in the audience probably know, is there were some reports linking use of mercury with autism, which have been debunked nonetheless. In my office, we only use mercury-free vaccines for influenza in an effort to encourage women to get vaccinated. The Moderna and Pfizer vaccines absolutely do not contain any mercury products.
Yeah, it's a totally different technology. So anything that would have been used in the older preservatives for these vaccines would not be used here as these lipid nanoparticles, which are totally different. Yeah.
So if someone's had COVID previously, should they be vaccinated?
Yes. The answer to that,
100%.
on the CDC website, first of all, they give a clear answer on that. And let's talk about why for a moment. As we mentioned before, Dr. Bander and I have been running plasma drives, trying to collect convalescent plasma to treat people during the first wave. And now we're working towards hyperimmune globulin product that will hopefully, that's research trials starting at Mount Sinai, again, a product, an antibody product to try to treat people. What we've seen is that people have lost their antibodies from the first wave to the second wave. We've had people that have tried to donate, and we have found that their antibodies have disappeared. Now, what that means exactly and why we haven't seen a huge barrage of reinfections, that's not clear. But the takeaway point is that being infected with the virus only seems to convey immunity for a certain amount of time. And that seems to be different for everyone, and we don't completely know how long that's going to be. And furthermore, there is no reason that getting the vaccine, based on what we've described thus far as to how it works, should do anything to hurt you if you still have your own antibodies there in the first place. And so the CDC website recommends it. I can tell people that in the hospital for providers, it's recommended that even if you had COVID already and you're offered the vaccine, you should take it. And I would suggest the same for the general population.
Can I just ask a question here? Are the antibodies that are created by the immune response your body has from the vaccine more durable than what you might just contract out on the street?
I think it's a great question, and we don't know the answer. Again, the reason we know the vaccines work is they look to see if people who during the vaccine period were infected with COVID. And so if you look at the numbers, those who got the vaccine, there was 95% reduction in those who got it in terms of developing the disease. So it works. So are the antibodies more robust? They're definitely very different. I mean, you're producing a different subset of antibodies. So we don't know. And remember, it's interesting. We saw people with mild cases have less antibodies and they go away faster. So I think that this is why it's important that it's a 2-time for this type of vaccine, is that the first time your body learns a little bit and the second time is memory. That's why, measles, mumps, and rubella shots are twice. I mean, your body just learns the second time better. So I do think probably, you'll make different antibodies having the vaccine, but it's equivalent. We don't give you measles, the vaccine is just as effective as having the disease. So I don't think it's relevant in the end, but it's a good scientific question.
Thank you.
And anticipating your next question, we do not also know how long the vaccine provides protection. That's going to be part of what's followed in the months to come, because it just hasn't been around long enough. We have to remember with all of this that we really only have a short period of time that we're dealing with. So we're learning as we go as to how these antibodies work and how they're protecting people.
So a question that's come up frequently is, if I do receive the vaccine, do I still need to socially distance? Do I still need to wear my mask? We know the answer to that is yes, but it's created a lot of confusion as to why. Why would I need to continue to mask? Why would I need to continue to socially distance? And if I need to continue those measures, why should I take the vaccine?
So two things to say about that. The first is what Dr. Bander had said just a few minutes ago. The vaccine is not 100% in either of these studies. So you can't know for sure if you did mount a sufficient enough of an immune response. There were some people who did still get COVID, even in the vaccine side of the both trials. Number two is we also don't know for sure that somebody who had COVID before can't still in some way carry it if they get exposed to COVID later on. They may not get sick themselves, but you can't know for sure that that person can't be transmitting. These are things that we just don't know for sure. And so till we get to that point as a society, for the safety of our loved ones, it's best to continue to follow these guidelines of socially distancing and masking. Jeff,
I think we're moving towards that, obviously, right? So it's like going to be hard to say you can wear masks. You know, it's just kind of one step for society now. But yeah, obviously, once we have enough people vaccinated, we'll be able to start moving away from that. But for right now, because people aren't vaccinated, we're going to have to stick with that because it's going to just be hard to have that I'm on, I'm off type thing. So I think it's just a society guideline. If we're all vaccinated and we're all in one room together, we all know it. I think, you know, the mask will come off. I think we can get off the messaging on that one.
Any idea when the vaccines will be available for the general population, and when, I know this is a difficult question to answer, when we may get back to some semblance of what we would consider our life before COVID? Because I think if people know there's an end in sight, I know for me personally, I can hang on because I see that there is a success at the end of this awful, awful narrative. And it's giving me personally motivation to stay the course. Is there any time frame, realistic time frame that you can share with us?
Well, I think, I watch the news, read the papers as much as anyone else, but I've also listened to what we're being told by the hospital. I've been on some of those meetings. Obviously, right now, there's only enough to where we're targeting providers to start with. And then even within the providers, there's a subset of providers. We're trying to target the people who are frontline, who are going in frequently and most exposure to COVID. From what we're hearing, there's going to be a ramp up of the amount of vaccine available as we get towards the spring. I would also point out that while we have 2 that have emergency use authorization right now, Pfizer and Moderna, as I think you yourself mentioned just a few minutes ago, there's both AstraZeneca and a Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which there's early whispers that those might be viable products to come soon as well. And so I would hope, and this is a hope, I'm not speaking from any knowledge, that by the time we get to the spring of 2021, hopefully the vast majority of the population could be vaccinated and we can start moving towards a more normal society like we were used to before. I don't think I can give an answer, though, that's based on any fact, but that's more based on what we're hearing, as well as based on what we're seeing scientifically, that there might be 2 more vaccines on the horizon.
It's a logistics operation. If I'm a betting man, I'll say 6 to 9 months, we can start heading back to reality.
Which is really incredible when you think about where we were in April. You know, we first got the gene sequencing, I think, in January, February. The pandemic was at its peak here in April. And here we are in December talking about a horizon that's, I can feel it.
So close. And that's why it's important for people to trust the vaccine.
But I think it's important for us to reiterate, we touched upon it earlier, the rapidity, the speed with which this has happened is unparalleled in the history of medical science. But each step along the way, there was no cutting of the corners of safety. It went through the same rigorous, independent medical board assessment of each vaccine. And for example, in New York, not only did they not accept at face value the recommendations of the FDA and the CDC, but New York State convened its own independent panel, some of whom are faculty at Mt Sinai, independent, no horse in the race. So I think we can reasonably easily dispel those concerns about the speed with which it was introduced.
Yeah, I just want to add again, just as the silver lining to all this is, I was involved, a lot with Operation Warp Speed, and we talked about a lot of the antibody therapeutics because Josh and I are both involved in developing the HIG products. This is equivalent to the Manhattan Project here. What's happened here? You would never have taken something like this and get it to market and mass produced. I mean, this is very proud to be an American type moment. Even though we sold more vaccines abroad because we're good capitalists too, but we've developed something absolutely amazing here. So, I think we'll get through this, and I think we'll look back at this as saying this was a turning point.
I had no real specific other pressing questions, but was there anything else you think that's important for us to cover that we haven't touched upon, or any thoughts?
Dr. Grazi, just to jump in, we have several members of Hatzalah just asking us to address the following, so just want to make sure we get to it before we wrap. There has been legitimate use of oxygen concentrators for those discharged from hospital as they go home and they may need some oxygen support in the home setting. They've been given either oxygen support machines from the hospital or from the Shomrim or other organizations in our community. And that's been a very helpful use of oxygen concentrators. However, in other cases, Hatzalah shows up at the home of an individual who has just recently contracted the disease and has been using an oxygen concentrator without doctor's supervision or oversight. And really it's masking their hypoxia or other issues they may have. So just wanted to see if, Doctor, we can have the doctors just comment on that and make sure it's clear to folks the appropriate use of oxygen support in the home setting post-discharge, if those people need it, under care of a following and continuing medical supervision, and the inappropriate use of oxygen concentrator in the early period where it might be masking a very serious condition that needs attention. Please, Doctor.
I think that's the point, is that this Russian roulette game that we're playing. So oxygen on the way out, very reasonable. In fact, as soon as you can just be on just a little bit of oxygen, Josh knows, Hoffman and Estes know, we try to get you out as soon as possible, and it's very appropriate. Sometimes it takes weeks to wean off of oxygen. The lungs are damaged, and that's perfectly safe as long as you're monitoring yourself. You're right. On the way in, we don't know if Hatzalah comes in and someone's newly on oxygen, we don't know if tomorrow they're going to need to be on a massive amount of oxygen, even a ventilator. And so those are the people that need to get in, those with new oxygen requirements who are worsening. And as Josh said, it's not just the oxygen, it's how they look to breathing. Hatzalah should bring them in. They should be encouraged to come in. If they're not bad, we'll send you home. So you waste some time in the hospital. It's definitely worth it for us to identify you, screen you, and make sure you're okay. So if you're starting off on oxygen and it's getting worse, be evaluated either at home or in the hospital.
And both Jeff and I have been in touch with Hatzalah. We've had this conversation literally, it's probably over 100 times, probably each of us at this point, about patients. 100% correct. If you are at that point, you really should be getting evaluated by a physician.
Great. No, thanks. It's helpful to Hatzalah members who are facing this in the field and seeing this and reporting back to us on this issue. So the more we get the word out to the community, the better on that point.
If I could just add a personal note, those of us who live in this community, the broader Sephardi community in Brooklyn and in Deal, we live here because of a sense of purpose and a sense of community, a sense of belonging. And I think we all need to think very clearly, very seriously about the role we're going to play in protecting each other. I think a lot more people will be comfortable about the concept of vaccination because we'll have a lot more data by the time the vaccine becomes available to the general public. I personally reached out to my chairman on Monday to ask when can I get the vaccine. I don't yet have it available to me, but I'm willing to get it tomorrow. I understand the hesitation that people will have who are not working in hospitals to take the vaccine right now. But you don't have to make the choice right now because it's not available yet to you. By the time it becomes available in 3 months or 4 months or 6 months, we're going to have a lot more data. And I really hope and pray that you'll sense the need as a member of this community. We've always been there for each other. We've always protected each other. It's why we live here. It's not because of the plush lawns. I laughed that we have gardeners that come to mow our 6 feet by 8 feet front lawn. It's not why we live here. It's not why we choose to live the way we live. We choose to live here the way we live because we're one people. And please think about that responsibility. You'll be more comfortable as data comes out. And please think, don't be dismissive without a good, deep, thoughtful look at where we need to get to protect our parents, our elderly parents, to protect our loved ones and get our children back into schools on a consistent basis, et cetera. So that's a personal plea. As someone who is involved in medicine and has chosen to live in this community, think about it. Thoughts? Closing comments?
I would, just to close, first of all, that was beautiful. And I couldn't have said it better myself, is to just think about how your decisions are affecting other people right now. I'd like to just briefly share with the community, for those who don't know, we had the first wave. We slowed down during the summer. Jeff and I have been nonstop now, probably since about Labor Day. And it's from the majority of the people coming are Orthodox Jews. And that's both Sephardic and Ashkenaz. And we have a love for each other. We crave community. We crave social interaction. It's hurting us right now. And we are, for the moment, still the face of the people that are getting infected the most. It looks like it's coming to the rest of the city, the rest of the state, the rest of the country. But let's try to slow it down within our own population and just try to follow these measures till we get to that point that we can all be safe and be back together.
Amen. Dr. Bander, any final
Oh,
words?
I think these forums are really important. I think that, as a continuity, we should probably do it again. And as we, get updates on things, as we've been doing with other communities too, updating you on where we are. And I think that back and forth is so important to understand how to treat these diseases. And I think we've done much better as a community than other communities, because we have this back and forth and trust between the doctors and the community. And I think that's really important. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you both for joining. Jack?
Dr. Grazi, I just want to add to your really very moving comments and to the doctors. One, just to be even more specific, building on what you said, there'll be at least 20 million people in the United States who get vaccinated before the vaccines are generally available to our community. 20 million data points. So there'll be a lot of information, 14.5 million healthcare workers, 2.3 million seniors who live in congregate settings, long-term nursing facilities and other such facilities, as well as about 2-3 million other essential workers before the general availability will happen. So that's 15 to 20 million data points that we'll have that will build the assurance and build confidence, I hope, for members of the community. We all care about our kids. We care about getting schools open and keeping schools open. This is the pathway. This is the pathway that we can get there, in a way that brings normalcy back to our lives, allows our kids to go to school. And if we want to do it for anybody, we should do it for the kids.
Great.
And so with that, I want to thank the doctors for your tireless work day in, day out. I'm sure we'll be on a call, maybe even midnight tonight, about some of the members of our community who unfortunately are hospitalized. Dr. Grazi, I really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for all you do for the community, what you've done in these sessions. And I believe that we'll be coming back with another session in mid to late January, once we have even more data to share. And I want to thank Jeff Beta and the SCA leadership for the doctors network that you put together and for the tremendous work that you're doing day in, day out to save lives in the community. Jeff, I'll turn it back to you. Jeff Beta.
Oh, thank you, Jack. I appreciate that. I just want to recognize everybody on this panel, Dr. Schottges, Dr. Bander, Dr. Grazi, Jack, Hidary. It's obvious you're all here out of a sense of love and caring for one another. You're not here because this is your job or your responsibility to sort of have to do this. None of you guys are sort of, calling it in, so to speak. We could tell it's coming from the heart. And for all the community members that joined us here today, obviously are on here because they're concerned about, their loved ones, their parents, their brothers, their sisters. So just to echo what Victor said, we're kind of all in this together. And it's great to see leadership and expertise and professionalism on display here on this panel. It gives us hope for the future. And your invitation for us to do this again, we will certainly take you up on that as the vaccine comes closer to being real for the majority of our population. And just want to thank you all very much, and thank everybody for joining that's out there.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.